This episode of Please Explain is sponsored by Aware Super, helping you get more from your future. From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Julia Karkatzel. It's Tuesday, July 18. Winning public funding for scientific research in Australia is usually a bare-knuckle business. A typical researcher will spend months every year just writing applications. Peer reviewers are brutal, and success rates for grants are often less than 10%. But since 2015, Australia has had another path. The $20 billion Medical Research Future Fund was offering hundreds of millions for scientific projects. It was heralded as a huge boost to the Australian science sector. Until now. An investigation by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald can now reveal that this fund, created by the former coalition government, handed out $500 million worth of those grants with no competition. And some of that money was sent directly to charities who lobbied the government. Today, national science reporter Liam Mannix on the multi-billion-dollar research fund dogged by questions about transparency, governance and value for money. So Liam, how did you come to report on this story? Where does this story start for you?
Well, really, this story starts about 6 years ago when I started as a science reporter with The Age. And at the start, you're reporting on these wonderful discoveries and breakthroughs from the scientific community. But all the way through, I was also hearing complaints. People would mutter and mutter and mutter about this $20 billion medical research future fund. And you'd think, $20 billion to a cash-strapped science community, it's something that they ought to be celebrating. But I rarely heard celebration. Mostly I was hearing complaints about this fund. So that carried on for the next 6 years until I was finally like, look, we need to sit down and find out what is happening with this fund. The other real genesis for this was sitting in a long COVID inquiry of all things. And Brendan Crabb, who is one of the major influencers behind this fund, just at the end, after he'd spoken about long COVID, he just sort of popped up and he was like, yeah, and the Medical Research Future Fund, we've got some real issues with that need to be addressed. And I was like, well, if Brendan thinks that and all of the science community think that, we ought to see if we can find if there's some fire to go with all this smoke.
Okay, but before we get into the issues with the Medical Research Future Fund, let's take a step back. What is it exactly and why was it first set up?
Your listeners might remember in 2014, the incoming Abbott government had a bit of a mandate to cut the budget. And one of the places that they wanted to cut most deeply was in health funding. They had some cuts that they wanted to do. They also had this really interesting idea about a $7 GP copayment. So every time you go to the GP, it'd cost you $7.
The AMA's President Brian Owler said the government's proposed $7 copayment also threatens the very foundations of the system.
So that was the stick. The carrot that the Abbott government offered to sort of offset the pain of all of these cuts was a $20 billion medical research future fund.
This fund, within 6 years, will be the biggest medical research endowment fund in the world.
The idea was money from the savings and money from the GP copayment would go into this fund. It had reached $20 billion, and then interest payments from that fund essentially would go towards paying for medical research. Now, you'll also remember that the community absolutely hated this idea and rebelled against it, and the $7 copayment ended up getting knocked over. But the scientific community saw an opportunity here and said, well, even if we're going to lose this copayment, this fund's really important. So they campaigned really, really hard on it. And, people like Brendan Crabb were flying up to Canberra every second week. And eventually they managed to get this fund established. And so it's been paid for largely out of just general revenue and now sits under the Future Fund as one of the government's largest pots of money. It's worth about $20 billion a year, and it disburses about $650 million, which is a lot of money for science.
Okay. And so there must have been excitement in the scientific community when it was first set up, because it would mean that their research would receive more financial support. And historically, that's been quite hard for scientists to get, right?
they were incredibly excited. Like that's a really key part of the puzzle. They thought this thing was going to be their savior. So you're right, like science funding has been in decline as a percentage of GDP for, I think, 15 years in this country. And that's sort of having all of these horrible knock-on effects. Young scientists are unable to get jobs. Older scientists are unable to get research grants. Scientists are being squeezed out of this profession that they love. So they really thought that this fund would come in and be their saviour. It would add, I think, about 50% to Australia's health research budget. But, you know, as one of the scientists we quote in the article said, it didn't work out like that. Instead of being their saviour, for some, it has been a bit of a nightmare.
Let's talk about that. What are some of the concerns your investigation has raised about the fund and the way it operates?
So the core concern that we and scientists held about this fund was a type of grant that this fund can give out called an ad hoc grant. Now, most science funding is given out in peer-reviewed competitive grants. So the government will say, we want to research cancer, give us your best ideas. Those ideas are evaluated by a panel of expert scientists and the best ones are funded. The Medical Research Future Fund was meant to operate in largely the same way. But unlike other funds here and globally, the Medical Research Future Fund allows the Minister for Health a significant degree of discretion over how funding is spent. In particular, the Minister or the Department can authorise these ad hoc grants. And an ad hoc grant essentially means that money goes to one organisation without a tender, without competition. Now, the reason we have competition and peer review is to make sure that the money is going to the best possible places. So we said, all right, well, where's this going? And are we able to show that every single project that it has gone to is of the highest quality? And we looked in two areas. First of all, we were interested in grants given in or near marginal electorates timed around elections. And we came across a couple of really interesting examples. So in Burnie is a major town in northern Tasmania. And in the 2019 election, that region and its two electorates were sort of tipped as very key to the coalition winning government. In 2018, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Health Minister Greg Hunt flew into Burnie to announce a new Centre for Excellence in Regional and Rural Health. Turnbull said it's going to be built right here. It's going to make the University of Tasmania a global leader in regional health right in this key regional town. Now, we have since learnt that that centre was in fact never built and does not exist. And the University of Tasmania, in fact, never requested the centre in the first place and didn't want it. We spoke to a leading scientist there who said to us that they already had a centre that was very similar to this, and it really didn't make sense to build another one. So after the government had announced the funding, the university quietly went to the government and said, could we spend this on something else? And some of that money ended up being spent on a research project based out of Hobart, not Burnie. So that's one case. Another one that I thought was really interesting was a research centre that was established in southern Sydney. It was established in a Labor electorate, but right on the edge of two key Liberal electorates. And this centre was established by a foundation. The foundation had been casting around for a big idea. It had tried a different one and hadn't got research funding for it. And so in 2016, a renowned microbiome expert arrived and the foundation said, right, let's do the microbiome. And suddenly a very large quantum of money poured in, $6 million, some of it in closed non-competitive grants directly from the government, which allowed them to establish the Microbiome Research Centre. And then they got another $2 million from the Medical Research Future Fund in ad hoc funding that allowed them to do microbiome research. And I called a couple of microbiome researchers and said, what's the deal with this? And they said, we'd never heard of this group and this organisation until they started getting this money. If there was a competitive process, we don't think they would have been very competitive. So it really paints a picture of a fund which was giving out ad hoc, non-competitive grants, and there are questions about some of the projects those grants went towards.
Okay, so there are obviously questions about whether these funds could be used to have sway in marginal seats. But what about the way politicians are also being lobbied? Because that's another element of this investigation, isn't it?
Yeah, we also looked at lobbying. Now, charities and scientists are allowed to lobby, and there is an argument that perhaps they should lobby. If you're a scientist, you want to make sure that the government knows about your problem and is well educated. If you're a charity, you're representing, your constituency in some ways. You're making sure that people know about the needs of children with brain cancer, for example. But we were able to show that the government was giving out ad hoc, non-competitive funds in some cases following being lobbied. One of those cases is a vaccine for strep A. Now, a group of researchers had been talking to the government for several years and saying, we really need to do something about this disease. It's horrible. It affects Australia's Indigenous community. We need a vaccine. And the government eventually said to them, okay, apply for funding, and a $35 million ad hoc grant to develop a vaccine was given to these researchers. Now, they're excellent researchers by all accounts, but because they got the funding directly, it means that there was no competitive process. And there are other teams in Australia developing strep A vaccines who would have really liked to have tendered for that money. And they told me that they were disappointed that they didn't get a chance to. Now, was their vaccine going to be better than this group's project? We don't know. But we also can't know because no competitive process was ever run.
Okay, that's all very shocking to hear, Liam. And do we know just how much money has been given out through these ad hoc or non-competitive grants?
More than $500 million, Julia. Now, the former Health Minister, Greg Hunt, made the case very strongly that the vast majority of the funding that came out through the MRFF was peer-reviewed, and he's right. About 90% of it was peer-reviewed, but the remaining 10% still represents a very large amount of money.
So, Liam, what's been the fallout of all of this? Is anyone currently being held to account? We're talking here about, as you say, $500 million worth of medical funding being spent.
It's been quite dramatic, actually. Dr. Monique Ryan, who's an independent MP and a former medical researcher, led the charge on Saturday after we published our stories. She came out and said straight away, it's well known within the sector that this fund is a joke, and that she felt that grants would often be written and her PhD students would say to her, could we apply for this one? And she'd say, no, that's clearly been designed to direct money to so-and-so researcher. It's not a truly competitive grant, which is, I think, a pretty remarkable claim. So Dr. Ryan's led the way, but the groundswell from the scientific academies and scientists themselves has been really strong too. I don't think this fund has many defenders and it has a lot of critics. The scientific academies have come out on the front foot and said, we need to change this. This fund should be moved away from sort of being directly in the health department and should be moved under the control of an independent body. And Health Minister Mark Butler said to us that he was very concerned by the things that were brought up in our reporting, and that science funding should generally be above politics, which is, I think, a pretty strong statement. So look, we're hopeful that there will be some reform around this fund and that it can be made more independent, because, one of the other real themes that emerged from the reporting is everybody cares about this fund and they want it to succeed. There are no haters here. Everybody wants this thing to work. They're just concerned that it's not. So hopefully that's what can come out of this, Julia.
And it is really disappointing because, coming back to the start of our conversation, medical research is obviously incredibly important and chronically underfunded in Australia. And it feels like if we can't make this body independent, the only solution is to shut down the fund. And in that case, no one really wins.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Julia. Nobody wants that outcome. They want this fund to work, and hopefully, the government's announced a review process. Hopefully that review can go some way to fixing it up and rebuilding the confidence in the sector so people can sort of talk about this fund with pride rather than with concern.
Thanks so much for your time today, Liam.
Thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by me, Julia Karkatzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Julia Karkatzel. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening. This episode of Please Explain was brought to you by Aware Super. With super advice and super returns, Aware Super is super helpful. For more information about Aware Super, including their PDS and TMD, visit aware.com.au.